Hello, dear colleagues. Happy Friday. It's a beautiful spring day, maybe not quite as in bloom as this lovely photo of the oval that you see behind me, but nevertheless, we're on our way. Welcome to our last colloquium of this academic year, 21-22, with the theme, A World on Edge. Our last speaker, who was scheduled for next week, is not able to join us, unfortunately. So many thanks to Joel Wainwright and the rest of the speakers committee for organizing this wonderful series for us this year, A World on Edge. Much appreciated. And thanks to everyone again for the online pivots that we've made. So the webinar format, Suzanne and Kim Miller for shepherding us through that. So anyway, it's a wonderful opportunity to sit back and listen to our former chair, Professor Morton O'Kelly, talk about a really timely topic of interest to many of us. So with that, I will turn it over to Joel.
Thanks, Darla. Can you hear me all right? All right. Great to see you, everyone. This is, as Darla just mentioned, the very last of the 2020 to 2021 lecture series on the theme, A World on Edge. It's also the last talk during my term as the chair of the Speakers Committee. So I'd just like to start by saying a quick thanks, not only to the committee, but to all the staff that I've worked with over the last 4 years. It's been a real pleasure to work with all of you, and particularly this year with the tricky shift to the online format. It's been really a great pleasure. So thank you. And now it's my great pleasure to reintroduce to all of you Morton O'Kelly, Professor Emeritus in our own department, who will deliver our second TAFE lecture of this year. After taking his bachelor's with honors in geography and economics from the University College Dublin, Morton moved to Canada and in 1981 received his PhD from McMaster University in geography. He left Canada to take up a position here in Ohio State and has never left. So Morton has now been a member of this department for 4 decades. During this time, he has served as our chair, not once, but twice, a testament to his leadership. And in fact, during those 2 periods, I think most of the present faculty in the department were hired. Along the way, he also served as an associate dean in our college, and then recently served as the dean of social and behavioral sciences, a position he held until his retirement at the very end of 2020. And through all of this, Morton has maintained a very steady stream of excellent scholarship in his core areas of expertise: transportation geography, spatial analysis, and location modeling. So Morton clearly needs no real introduction to this department. We know him very well. Still, let me share with you 3 things that you may not know and which help to introduce his TAFE lecture. First, Morton is probably one of the few active geographers who co-authored work with Ned TAFE. In 1996, they wrote and published a new edition of Ned's book, Geography of Transportation, co-authored also with Howard Gauthier. This was a book that Morton actually studied while he was an undergraduate in Ireland. So by delivering today's TAFE lecture on the geography of transportation, we are truly coming full circle. Second, you may not know that in 2017, Morton was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award in location analysis from the Institute for Operations Research and Management Sciences section on location analysis. This is an award that's only given out once every 3 years. Morton was supposed to deliver a plenary in honor of receiving this award at the 2020 ISOLD conference, but the conference was postponed, of course, on account of COVID, so Morton will deliver it later this year. So if you like today's talk, reach out to Morton and get those details, and perhaps you can hear more when he gives that lecture. Lastly, and most obscure, you may never have realized it, but one anagram for Morton O'Kelly's name is meekly low. That's right, meekly low. I think it's safe to say, however, that Morton is not one to go down meekly. He retired at the end of 2020, but he's still here, he's still very active, and he still has a lot to teach us about transportation and geography and our world on edge. But don't take my word for it. Let's hear from him. Please join me now in welcoming Morton O'Kelly for the second Ned TAFE lecture of 2020-2021, Airlines on the Edge.
Thank you, Joel. Let me take a minute to set up my screen share. Hopefully you see a single page. Is that correct, everybody? Just wondering if that's okay?
Yep,
That
looks
looks
great.
good. Looks good, Morton.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much. First, let me say what an honor it is, particularly to be invited to give the TAFE lecture, to recognize Dr. TAFE. Ned was a true inspiration to myself and to others. He was a strong leader of the department. And when I came here, I was fresh out of grad school and about as green as you can be. And Ned was kind and very patient and very, I would say almost like a father figure in terms of his demeanor. I'd also like to thank Joel for inviting me and the committee, and very generous and well-prepared remarks. So thank you very, very much. I think I need to begin today's talk with an acknowledgement of the immense human cost and suffering that we've had from the pandemic in the past year. I think it would be better for me, I think, to recognize that in a time of enormous suffering, I definitely do not want to express fetishism for networks or a technological kind of focus in my talk. We cannot give the impression that these concerns in any way outspeak the other concerns that we've had. So condolences to everybody who's had loss. We've all had some sufferings during this period, and let's hope that we're on the way to a better time. So I think today, in today's talk, in keeping with the well-chosen theme for this year's lecture series, The World on Edge, I particularly want to speak about the role of air transport in this current climate. And Ned's instinct would have been to look for spatial regularity, for patterns, for divergence. He was a big fan of map analysis. This was deeply ingrained in the way Ned looked at the world. And it led to him looking for maps and patterns and examining to see if there was processes that he could understand. So I'd like to take a moment in today's talk to reflect on a picture of my research interests, which have been, as Joel indicated, ongoing for 40 years. I haven't changed too much. And to show where geographers in particular have a great role to play in understanding of the current situation for airlines and concomitantly then for the rest of the world. So we're talking about airlines both before, during, and after the pandemic. And really what we want to do is see what have airlines done. So what I want to begin with is a very, very remarkably early indication that the world was in trouble back in January of 2020. Now, perhaps we all knew this before, but in 2020, there was a very early alert published in the Journal of Travel Medicine, which noticed that an emerging virus of unknown etiology in Wuhan, China, had potential to spread throughout the world. And they were right on the money. They published this map as a front cover of the journal, and it shows how networked we are and how if something happens in one corner through what you might think of a small world phenomenon, it's very rapidly going to spread throughout the rest of the world. And so this was published online in January the 14th, 2020, over a year ago, and it came out online on March 2020. And so this was an early indication of an emerging potential problem, which, as we see, did come to pass. So I think it's fair to say that airlines had a role and have a role in contributing to this viral spread. That, looking at a map like that or just imagining our connectivity, it's clear that airlines contributed to viral spread. A very early study again showed that Mexico would be vulnerable to infection within weeks of an outbreak, not because of direct connections to Wuhan, but through secondary connectivity through hubs. Our degree of interconnection is so high that people readily got the idea that within a matter of months, if not weeks, we would have a global response. And it took WHO some months, in fact, to declare a pandemic, but the writing was on the wall, if I can use a phrase, from early in 2020. And the global spread map, if you look at global hubs, which I study in my research, you'll notice big cities. Let me show you a map here. So this is a kind of a portrait of the world. The lines, the curved lines are network connections between regions. And the regions here for the purpose of this map are continental scale, South America, North America, Africa, etc. And if you take a picture and look at the spread potential, the big hubs are shown in those 3-letter codes. So Chicago, Atlanta, you recognize those in the US, London Heathrow, Charles de Gaulle, Frankfurt, and then to Peking and Hong Kong in Asia. And so it's clear that the major world regions were connected through gateways and hubs, and they were joined up in a way that you set something in motion, it's very likely that spread would happen. And this is something that is particularly relevant for a city that's not actually called out here. Well, actually it is, DXB, that's Dubai. So we'll come back to Dubai later, but Dubai in some sense is a crossroads for global interconnection, and it turned out to have an important role. So, before I go into some of those examples, I'd like to just mention briefly how we transport geographers, try to look at airlines. How do we organize our thinking about airlines? And this is a little bit, not too technical, but certainly it's the fact that when we look at airlines, we tend to have a sort of a topology or a way to organize our thoughts. So one type of airline is an airline that focuses on a single big hub, and it flows people in and out of that location, and it's like a crossroads for the entire network. That's at one extreme. Sort of set that aside as one bookend. At the opposite end of that spectrum are what are called point-to-point networks. This would be a network where there's almost like a direct connection between pairs of cities. So say you fly directly from St. Louis to Columbus, as you can do on Southwest Airlines. So point-to-point is another bookend in terms of this continuum of network types. We have to look at other types of networks as well. Multi-hub networks, these are ones that are a bit more complicated. They have multiple major connection points, and they're almost have a choreographed set of connections between regions. And then there's complex networks. You might think of these as ones that we didn't classify elsewhere, but a complex network might happen if, say, you took 2 legacy carriers and you join them together. You sort of bolt them together. You sort of get a weird network because of the nature of the origins of the networks. So this is the way that myself and Yonghwa Park, who studied this topic in detail for several years now, how we like to look at airlines and how geography helps us to organize our thinking about airlines. So I want to show you a picture of graphically of what a one-hub network looks like. So graphically, it might look like this. These are actually 3 stylized pictures of one-hub networks. The first one is Emirates on the left, number 17 network there. In the middle is Turkish Air, and on the right is Iberia Air. And you notice it almost looks like a single major nexus at the middle, and almost everything goes in and out through. There's a few stray connections as well, but mostly it's highly dominated by these central nodes. So you can imagine that that's an important crossroads or focal point for a network of that sort. So bear that in mind as one bookend. And so in contrast to that, I need to show you a picture, similar picture of what a point-to-point network is, and you'll get the contrast very readily. So to the lower right of this picture are some point-to-point systems. So these are not like the first type. These are quite different. And examples would be Southwest Airlines, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, Ryanair, which is in Europe, and EasyJet, which is also predominantly in Europe. And notice in this case, it looks almost like more like a plate of spaghetti. You've got lots and lots of connections point to point. And so here you have aircraft flying back and forth between city pairs, and they're not doing kind of a hub interchange action at the center of the network. So these are the 2 polar types of networks. Then in the middle, we have 2 others, the complex and the multi-hub. So I think one of the questions from my talk today, and something we'd like to look at as geographers, is what effect does this network stylized map have on the ability of networks to spread, to provide connectivity? How do things shape up when we look at a Southwest, for example, compared to a Delta? So what effect do these network shapes have on connections and spread? I think you don't have to be a transport expert to realize that a network with a big hub is a major problem in terms of mixing and blending people. They're coming from all areas. They're coming almost to what I'm calling in the first blue block here, a petri dish. There's a mixing and exchange of people coming from north, south, east, and west, and they're exchanging, getting out of one aircraft, walk through the airport, get into another. Clearly, that's a big mixing problem. And in normal times, this is not a bad thing. This is the way airports operate. They're mixing grounds. They have stores, they have fast food restaurants, they have bookstores. You can buy a new battery for your laptop. You can I think maybe in some cases even catch a movie. I mean, some big airport hubs are very much almost like a city center in terms of their pedestrian traffic. But you have to recognize that both the origins and destinations that are connected there are really widespread and far afield. So air travel clearly, again, everybody understands this. I think you would expect air travel to have a role both in the normal commerce and interaction, but also as a potential for a huge mixing ground and a challenging arena. So I was very fortunate to take this picture in December of 19, so before the news of the pandemic, in Miami. So this gives you a good clue. This is a picture of a small portion of the departure board from Miami, taken on 16th of December 2019. And so as you know, Miami in Florida is connected, and this shows you Mexico City, Nashville, Tennessee, New Orleans, New York, Montreal. And that's just a small patch. And if you went to the other letters of the alphabet, you'd see that Miami is a crossroads, particularly from South America and Latin America to North America. And we have a shot here of just how open our systems are and how quickly, as I said at the beginning, Mexico might not be directly connected to Wuhan, but it's certainly very connected by a small number of hops, and it's likely to be open in the system in that sense. So before I get into examples of showing you what this might mean for the spread and the implications, I want to just do a quick, almost technical detour, very, very brief, no math, but just a quick detour into how us geographers who study this thing tend to look at macro measures of airlines. So we've got an airline like Delta. I think everybody has a gut feeling about what Delta is like. So how do you go about empirically classifying, categorizing, explaining, or showing the size and distribution and complexity of an airline like Delta? And then by contrast, some that are unlike Delta, how do they compare? So one way we do this is by measuring what's called a degree distribution. And this is a very easy concept once you get the hang of it. Just take all the cities Delta serves and then look at their biggest city, Atlanta. It serves in hundreds of cities. And then maybe we take a second city like Minneapolis, St. Paul. It's also a Delta hub. It serves maybe not quite as many as Atlanta, but a significant number of nodes. And then you come all the way down to a Columbus or a Raleigh, North Carolina. We serve a good number of cities with Delta, but not anywhere near like the big ones. So when you do this, you're able to get a picture. I'll show you a graph in a second, a picture of Delta's organization in terms of picture, showing all the way from its biggest, most important node all the way down to its itty-bitty ones that serve very few. So when you do this, you recognize that some nodes in this network have, use this awkward word here, betweenness. It's actually a technical term that we use a lot. Betweenness is like a measure of how much interaction goes through the big, busy places. And clearly, Atlanta's betweenness is far, far higher than Columbus. We don't have any between traffic in Columbus. If you fly into Columbus, pretty certain you're just getting out of the plane and going home or driving to Dayton. But if you fly into Atlanta, there's a very good chance you're taking an onward connection to someplace else like Tallahassee. So betweenness and distribution, we can measure entropy, which is kind of like a measure of, are all the nodes the same in the network, or are some of them distinctively different? Is there a big disparity between the top and the bottom? And entropy will be very, very low when there's a highly distinctive single city and a lot of different cities. And entropy will be very high when there's a lot of similar cities. That's a measure we make. And I'll leave out the power law one for now, just to get to the picture here to show you what Delta looks like. So Delta, there's a whole literature on this stuff, but when you plot Atlanta, which is shown here on the picture, all the way down through the smaller itty bitty cities, well, look, there's almost a straight line plot. So this is very indicative. It's like a signal that that network is telling us. Delta looks like this because its network structure is set up with a major hub and a lot of smaller nodes, and that's just the way it is. And when we come to look at other airlines later, I'm going to ask you to kind of remember this picture and see how different Emirates is, see how different Turkish Airlines is, see how different Ryanair is. They won't look like this at all. So bear in mind kind of a standard that we can kind of get our heads around, and then recognize that there'll be others later that don't look like this at all. So Delta is going to be our running example throughout this talk, because I think everybody has a gut feeling about what Delta looks like. And so we can learn a lot by a comparison and a contrast to this particular case by comparing characteristics, like it's our signal of this network. How does our other network compare? So this is a bit more technical than I can really go into, but when I take that picture I just showed you, which is this one here on the top left, I can also then make other comparable measurements that will give us slightly different versions of the same data, but all of them are essentially coming down to this, that there's a straight line relationship that you see here. And often when we have hub networks, there's a big gap or a hole in this trace picture right here, meaning that there's a distinction between the top view and the bottom view. In other words, there's a gap. Now, is that gap a big gap or a small gap? It depends on the network. So it'll be different from other networks. I can just foretaste this for you a little bit. For something like KLM, Dutch Airlines, that gap will be very big. And for something like Ryanair, that gap will be very small. So that's by comparison to where Delta is. So this tells us a significant way that we can stack up airlines. This is work that's ongoing. My own research at the moment is we're preparing a paper that sort of does a global comparison of hundreds of networks and crank these numbers and show different types and almost make a topology of networks. So hopefully you get the idea now of Delta as our benchmark, and we're going to see how the others compare to that. So let me backtrack before the pandemic. I would have to say that airlines were doing really well. They handled all kinds of problems. And before the pandemic, they were doing exceptionally well. Now, for purposes of today's talk, I don't think we care very much about things like crew scheduling and maintenance. I mean, that is a problem airlines handle, but it's not a very geographical one. And so we'll set that aside. That's not something we need to worry too much about, although it is an important problem. Problems that they did handle that had a very high geographical impact, what we will talk about, are networks. What cities will we join up? What equipment will we use to fly back and forth? What locations will we use for our major operations? And how will we try to run our business in terms of the geographical scope? So as I said, we are studying literally hundreds of airlines. And when you work at that scale, you can't go and handcraft an analysis for every one. You need some kind of almost like a machine learning approach to take all the data and digest characteristic patterns and produce an overall picture that gives you some sensible idea. So I just have to say that before the pandemic, airlines were doing very, very well. They had this figured out. They had, you remember this, they were able to charge you extra fees for your baggage. If you wanted to get a better seat, they charge you a premium. They were making enormous profits. And they were, you remember, people were almost complaining about how crammed in you were on the aircraft. They're operating at capacity, and their fleets were operating flat out and crammed in. So this was the way we were right up until the turn of 2020 and even into 2020. Airlines were on track to make record profits. So don't cry for the airlines. They made a lot of money when things were good. Now we come to the pandemic. So what happened? And we all know this. And I won't belabor you with lots of statistics today, but essentially we had a collapse of demand, a reduction of demand for service to almost zero. I won't say it completely flatlined, but we went from airlines that were 80% full, running packed, flat out, airlines that had virtually a no comparable level of demand in the months that followed the pandemic. So the US we lost a lot in terms of travel. We lost, we had countries kind of closing and cutting off travel. Americans also lost, I have to say it, their cherished freedom to wander. You know, we were not allowed to go on study abroad or visit archives or field trip to sites in foreign countries. Impact on airlines was just short of catastrophic. They cried pretty hard that they had lost a ton of money. And they reacted almost to a one, similarly, by pulling back links, trimming the efficiency of their airlines, of their fleets. And we all agree that there is no quicker way to lose a ton of money than to fly around an empty aircraft. It's very expensive to fly per hour. The fuel costs are enormous. If you don't have people in seats there paying their way, that is going to lose a ton of money. And we went from 90% load factors, 80% load factors, to virtual reduction in service. And even as we're making a comeback now, we'll get to this later, but if you need to fly an airline with socially distanced passengers, you're giving up a third or more of your seats. And that's not a very good way either for airlines to operate. So before the pandemic, airlines were doing well, as I said, and how they are doing after the pandemic, this is the purpose of my talk today. I think it really does depend on geography. So for a geographer, and in the spirit of Ned Tafe, I want to tell you that geography makes a big difference here. And the impact of COVID on the airlines was very, very clear. I won't dwell on the bankruptcies, but some airlines were simply pushed into bankruptcy. That doesn't always mean they stop flying. It just means that they're in a reconstruction period. But certainly some of the weaker airlines that had a business model that was not able to survive went into bankruptcy. But the major carriers have had a remarkably similar set of reactions. First of all, they've cut back on their schedules. They've cut back on their schedules by canceling or rerouting or terminating some city pairs and not serving. They've put staff on furlough. They did promise as part of the CARES Act to keep people on for a certain amount of time, but eventually they cannot necessarily keep people on payroll when they're not flying. This may be news to you, but they also parked their aircraft. Where do they park them? They flew them to dry, non-humid locations with plenty of space and where they could keep them and stop them from rusting for X months or more. And they also scrapped some airlines. So some aircraft were taken out of service permanently. Dramatically accelerated the retirement of inefficient aircraft. This is something Yong Ha and I have been working on for some years and have several well-cited publications on this. There's no doubt that amongst the fleet of aircraft that are flying, there are some real dogs, some real gas guzzlers. And their days were numbered before the pandemic. Their days were over as soon as the pandemic hit. So you will not see today any Airbus 340s, Airbus 340, they're gone. And I'll mention more later. Another thing that happened, and I think we have to understand that this is a common business response, that many airlines accepted bailout and government support. So airlines were in line to receive help to keep people on payroll for when they could be back working again. So I think the size and shape and network structure of the airline is something that's really the theme of what I'm going to talk about and try to explain to you in the next few minutes. So I'm not sorry to see the end of some inefficient aircraft. We were predicting this before anyway, but they were accelerated. What I am a little sorry to see, and you'll find this in my slides coming up, is that some enormously expensive aircraft, such as an Airbus 380, which is multi-hundreds of $million cost, those things are sitting in the desert, staying cool and not being used right now because it's not possible to fly an airline and to put sufficient people into those large aircraft in this current pandemic. It's just not feasible to fly them, with some exceptions, which we'll come to. So overall, simply, airlines have coped with this pandemic in different ways. And one thing I'd like to show, this is actually a picture, this is from our book. This AB picture here shows the flow between gateways. So A and B in this hypothetical picture are gateways. And that means that flights from, say, the west come into hub A, they come in here, they transfer across a flow line from A to B, and they fly on to their destination over here at the other side. So that's a hypothetical picture in our textbook, and we call it gateways. What I want to do today is show you an example of such a gateway and show you the dramatic impact COVID has had on such a setup. So here's my first real airline. We've got lots of aircraft pictures coming up. So here's my first one. This is for Jens. So SAS, Scandinavian Airlines, it mostly flies intra-European traffic in Scandinavia. They have hubs in Copenhagen, Oslo, Stockholm. But they also fly from the US, especially on codeshare with other airlines. They fly from the US to European gateways. And here's a picture of that gateway picture, except I put in now not A and B, but Newark and Copenhagen. So SAS flies from North America to Europe and back. And Newark to Copenhagen in the good days pre-pandemic was going like gangbusters. There were thousands of people flying that route. I'll show you the numbers in a second, but essentially Newark to Copenhagen contained, okay, people flying from Newark to Copenhagen, that's understandable, but also people flying from connectors in the US through a connector in Newark to Copenhagen and on perhaps to connectors in the rest of Europe. And so those are the types of flows that absolutely collapsed as a result of the pandemic. You could see why you might still want to fly from Newark to Copenhagen, but nobody was willing to fly from my favorite combination like Fargo, North Dakota to Budapest. I mean, that was not going to be happening. So here's a picture of the numbers. So Newark to Copenhagen in pre-pandemic, just before the pandemic, had almost 190,000 total passengers, of which 50,000 were flying directly from Newark to Copenhagen. The rest, the other, were flying on connectors. And similarly, just for kicks here, Chicago to Stockholm, again, almost 150,000 passengers, of which 12,000 were flying direct. Others were the connecting type. I don't have a number slide to show you this, but when Young-Ha and I checked the data for in the midst of 2020, mid-year 2020, these data were absolutely flatlined. There's nothing going on these common links. So this is a very large connection that is zapped by the pandemic. So that's one example. Generally speaking, when we want to look at airlines, we really want to look at the range. That means how far is the flight, the connectivity, what's being connected. You can understand flying, say, from Kennedy to London Heathrow. It's a very, very busy pathway. There's multiple tens of flights. Well, there are many others. So when we look at the range and international connections, a key thing in understanding airlines is to understand the physical distance, geography right there, and the payload capability of the aircraft. How many people can you sit on there? As well, of course, as the fuel. And this is where we come into trouble. So airlines, there's an old phrase in the airline business called, it takes fuel to fly fuel. So if you're going to fly a long flight, you need to load that plane up with enough fuel to get you through your flight and have enough left in the tank to get to the other airport. You can't run out halfway. So it takes a lot of fuel to fly long range. And so long range flights have been a particular study of ours to look at their efficiency. And of course, now to look at what happened to them during COVID. What's been their experience? So I think we will be very interested to see, was it the long range flight that suffered? Was it the short range, or where are we? And jumping out of order a little bit here, but just to really fix an idea, this is a statistic we put in one of our papers a few years ago. If you take an 8,000 mile flight, which is a very long flight, you will use much more fuel than the sum of flying 4,000. So 2 times 4,000 flights, 4,000 is much less fuel than one 8,000 mile flight. Why? Because the 8,000 mile flight has to carry the heavy fuel for that entire journey. And so the fuel efficiency, generally speaking, is going to be better in terms of connecting through a hub or maybe having more moderate flight lengths. So the real fuel POG is when you fly Singapore to New York or from Australia to Europe. These are very, very long flights that have disproportionately high seat per mile fuel cost. So we want to look at some airlines, and we want to look at some particular outcomes, and we want to, ask you to remember, I use Delta as a backstop example. We're going to kind of contrast them with Delta. So an airline might have a big share of its seats in a short range service. It might be using relatively short, small scale. Think of Southwest Airlines. It's a perfect example. Or on the other hand, there might be some flights on a long range, having a huge fraction of its passenger miles over longer range flights. So I won't put a lot of formulas here, but I'm going to use a very, very simple piece of multiplication to convince you of one thing. Something called what we call seat nautical miles. What's a seat nautical mile? So a seat nautical mile is the product of seats times miles. So if I take 1,000 seats, 500 miles, I'm going to burn 500,000 seat nautical miles. Okay, that's okay. What about if I take 200 seats but take them much, much, much further? I could use 1,000,000 seat nautical miles. So a few people a long range can actually use more fuel than lots of people on a short range. And so the big airlines I'm going to talk about, like Lufthansa, KLM, Emirates, are in the business of flying longer range legs. And they are burning fuel much more aggressively, if you like, than airlines like Southwest Airlines, which are still using fuel, but using it in more like smaller bites. So if you start talking about seat nautical miles, you're very rapidly into the billions, if not trillions. So we have to do some scaling. We have to divide by some big number so we don't get enormous numbers. But very, very realistically, we could look at the percentage of all an airline's fuel bill. How much of it is it spending on short range flights, and how much of it is it spending on long range flights? That's a good handy thing to look at. So let's use my old friend Delta here and look at what Delta does. So Delta, the blue bars, I don't know if my cursor is showing, but the blue bars are this actual seats. So Delta flies a lot of short flights and fewer long flights, right? So Delta flies lots of short flights and fewer long flights. And the red jaggedy line is actually their seat nautical mile fuel consumption share. So actually it uses 10% of its total fuel budget in flights that are in this 9th bucket here. So relatively long flights for Delta in a 3,000–4,000 mile range are using a big share of their fuel. So bear that in mind. I won't say it's hard to say it's a typical airline, but let's just imagine this as our benchmark, and we can look at ones that are worse and better. And so notice that there's a big share of seat nautical miles in upper distance bands. And this is a characteristic of Delta. Now, Delta did not do well in the pandemic. They took advantage of all the things I mentioned before. They parked their fleet, they furloughed staff, and they lost over $1 billion in 2020. That's real money. They were making a lot of money beforehand, but they lost straight up $1 billion in 2020. They were hemorrhaging at one stage. I couldn't believe the numbers, like 20 million a day. They were going through cash burn at an enormous rate. So how about airlines that did perhaps better or worse? So I want to use Delta as a running example and then compare them with airlines like Lufthansa or Ryanair or others, because they have somewhat distinctive and different patterns. So, here's Lufthansa, KLM, and Emirates. I think you've probably heard of all of these. Lufthansa has German hubs. KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, flies out of Amsterdam, and Emirates flies out of that big crossroads I mentioned at Dubai. It's like if you're flying from Europe to Australia or Europe to Eastern Russia, you may be able to make a connection through Emirates, a gleaming modern airport, in some ways running because they're sitting on an ocean of oil and they can afford to run 380s flat out. So that's going to be a model we're going to be interested to see. How do they do during the pandemic? So first of all, Lufthansa, and I'll put the Delta picture on the small picture to the left here. Delta had a fairly good sized bump at the 9 mark, Lufthansa has a huge bump at the 11 mark. So a very big share of Lufthansa's seat nautical miles is coming from long range flights. They do have short range flights, but a huge share of their seats are from long distance flights. So I would judge them to be very vulnerable. They're vulnerable because they are reliant upon long range flights. And they are those gateway flights that, as I showed you earlier in the case of SAS, almost dried up. So we can expect trouble for Lufthansa. And just to contrast the technical picture I showed you before, Lufthansa has a multi-hub system, and they have a pretty sizable gap in here, indicating they have a big distinction between, say, Frankfurt and the rest of their system. I won't go. But here's what happened to Lufthansa. First of all, they grounded their entire fleet of large aircraft. That's Airbus 380s, that's those huge double-decker aircraft, and their 747s. They cut 90% of their long-haul travel capacity. And they parked many of their flights, decommissioned, scrapped, or sold them, including some of their older gas guzzlers. So, it forced them to trim and to correct inefficient aircraft that they could not sustain under this crisis. They ceased all Airbus 380 operations at the Frankfurt hub, and they operated only 20% of their intra-European flights. And they keep this in mind for later. I'm going to come back to this point. They decommissioned their local discount flight arm called Germanwings and its leisure airline Sun Express Deutschland. So Lufthansa suffered greatly, and they had to really cut to the bone in terms of some changes. And also, in June of last year, I regret I don't have more up-to-date information, but as of June, they laid off 22,000 people. And this was a major cut. So KLM, second example, I remember Delta it had a pretty big bump, but KLM has a huge bump. It's using 20% of its seat nautical miles in the 10th bucket of seats here. So this is a huge share of what KLM is doing. You could expect this makes them vulnerable. They were using a lot of fuel on things that stopped being very possible. And again, the technical picture shows you that there's a huge gap in the case of KLM. The difference between their hub and their regular nodes is huge, and they are just dying. They're really being killed. So KLM, they react to this problem. They're operating essentially a huge, I use the Petri dish image. Amsterdam is a huge Petri dish for them. They halted all intercontinental flights. This was as of January 21, the news is there. And you see the headlines, the Netherlands clamps down on COVID, and a picture of one of their nice aircraft. So they essentially are temporarily out of business because of their exposure to the kind of range and other parameters that I mentioned originally. I guess no great surprise. The question will be, can they bounce back? Will they get subsidies or loans to bridge the gap? And do we want them to come back? I mean, certainly, if you're concerned about enormous fuel consumption, I had a statistic in a paper I wrote a while back, is that a fully loaded aircraft taking off from Frankfurt and heading to Los Angeles, a very long journey, by the way, it would have, get this, 100 tons of, I was going to say 100,000 kilos, but 100 metric tons of fuel on board, 100 tons of fuel. And fuel engines are very efficient, and they do burn most of that off as H2O, water vapor, and some carbon dioxide. But there's no doubt that jet engines, no matter how efficient they are, also put out particulate matter. And this is a very, very expensive cost to the environment. If you think that's shocking, let's look at Emirates. Emirates is not like Delta at all. They have a huge share of their seat nautical miles in quite long distance ranges. And you'll see when we look at a map why this is. Emirates is in the business of flying people, say from London Heathrow to Dubai, Dubai to Melbourne, or Dubai to Beijing, or Dubai to, you name it. We'll look at their global network map in a minute. But they are essentially taking very large aircraft, in some cases, 380s, packing a lot of people, very nice flight, travels to the hub, get out and have a little break at the location, connect on, and away we go to our destination. That business also flatlined throughout the pandemic. So again, it's an airline whose signature is a giveaway that they're going to be in trouble because they have a huge differential between their biggest location and the rest of the nodes. There's a huge gap and differential. So this is a kind of old-fashioned map, but I think if you can take a close look, Dubai is at a crossroads in their system, connecting from some American cities, Orlando, New York, Boston, some African cities, connecting through Dubai to Guangzhou, to Beijing. I mentioned Melbourne, Sydney. This is a way, if you're traveling extremely long distance globally, this is one way we can do it. They had more or less a complete hard stop. They had to say, we cannot do this. So you can imagine a country whose sovereign wealth is somewhat invested in this big airline, this enormous purchase of expensive aircraft and huge physical facility. They were hurting and in trouble. They're run and managed by some very creative executives who thought hard about this, and they've talked a good game about making a comeback, but essentially they had to have a hard stop. They initially closed things and they made a tremendous effort to come back at a limited scale. How do they do this? By ensuring really thorough aircraft cleaning, almost like concierge handling of your baggage and your personal belongings. Put them in a sealed container, kiss your laptop goodbye and get it later, that type of thing. And they were, so vulnerable and at such a risk of a close down that they really have closed down a lot of their action. And I should look this up, but I didn't today. But I think that even as of today, there's been a great diminishment in the level of service provided by Emirates. So in summary on our airlines here, Emirates, KLM, and Lufthansa took a huge hit to operational demand. What are some of the factors? Well, lack of gateway-to-gateway travel. We saw here, let's personalize this. At OSU, if you were a student planning to go and study abroad, or you had a conference that you wanted to attend, or somebody had offered to give you a scholarship to visit an archive, or you were going to do field work in Guatemala, or whatever you had planned for 2020, I believe I was dean and chair. I remember Dean saying, we are not permitting any travel. So business travel was certainly verboten. And this was repeated around the globe. And this pattern of feeders and people getting into the air system basically dried up. And this vulnerability for crossroads hubs was amplified and really caused them to have to be curtailed. So I want to look at Ryanair, which is a point-to-point carrier, completely unlike Delta or Lufthansa or Emirates. So notice this picture is drawn the same way as the others, but notice how it looks completely different. We only have short flights on Ryanair. Ryanair flies, let's say, between Frankfurt and Dublin, or Bucharest and London, or actually probably Stansted. So they fly from cities that are close to big cities, but they often use out of center airports that are somewhat convenient, not perfect, but they're pretty good. So Belgium is a great example. They use Charleroi, not Brussels. In London, they don't use Heathrow. They use kind of peripheral. I'm not sure if it's Stansted or Luton, but certainly edge airports. But they do very well at this, and their whole business is like Southwest Airlines here, efficient, lots of similar aircraft running short point-to-point, intra-European vacation travel. If you're traveling to Mallorca or to Greece for holidays in Europe, you're probably getting on a Ryanair flight. So their picture, this won't make a whole lot of sense without the paper that explains the technicalities, but a picture for an airline like this has a characteristic shape that's quite different from Delta. Delta was a straight line. Here we have like a concave curve. That's like a signature of airlines that is running a lot of point to point. So the question, $1 million question, how's Ryanair doing and what's their reaction to the pandemic? And if you followed along at all, you'll realize that Ryanair is snapping up capacity. They are taking advantage of the pain that Lufthansa has experienced. They are recognizing that Lufthansa is not coming back, Germanwings is not coming back. They are busy negotiating airport slots around Europe to take over from those vacating failures. So here's what Ryanair Chair O'Leary said, no relative. Airports are realizing that a lot of Lufthansa's capacity is not coming back. They want to deal with an airline that's rapid and flexible. What we've done has been keeping all our planes, pilots, and crew current so we can pounce on growth. So they see this as a growth opportunity. And, you know, I would have to give it up to them that they are aggressive and creative about financing, about things like fleet management, about aircraft purchasing. I would hate to be across the bargaining table from those guys. They're very, very, very shrewd and careful negotiators. They are going to extract value from Boeing due to the 737 delay. You know, they are going to play all the cards. And as Chairman O'Leary joked, he said, Mrs. O'Leary wants to go on vacation. I want to be ready. And he wants to get the planes back in the air and be ready to fill those demands. So actually Ryanair, you might kind of anticipate this, they actually opposed the idea of bailouts being given to SAS, to Lufthansa, et cetera. They flat out said, you should not be doing this because they viewed it as an unfair subsidy to their competitors. Now, Ryanair did accept support to help their employees avoid furlough, et cetera, but they did not support European bailout money for coverage that's kind of masking structural problems or supporting coverage that they didn't think was fair. They argued that airlines should be able to make their own way and no need for subsidies or special treatment. Now, I'm going to make a quick detour. That's the 4 airlines I want to talk about. Quickly switching gear. In case you're concerned, airlines have had one bright light, one bright spot, and that is in capacity being transformed into carrying freight. So global air capacity is down because, you know, the air passenger flights are not carrying belly freight, but there's a conversion of flights to carry freight for the cargo industry. And there's been an accelerated e-commerce for commerce COVID has caused airlines to need to carry PPE. Express markets have been able to step in to cover some of the need to move materials that are needed for COVID. So one bright spot, and you can probably see this by looking at things like charter aircraft, freighters flying from China to Europe and to North America packed with material. And indeed, some airlines converting, move the seats out of the aircraft and convert them to just carry loads and loads of equipment and materials to make up for the capacity that they can't carry in people. So that's one aspect of the resilience of airlines. Excuse me. So I think I want to look at resilience. I wrote a paper on this a few years ago. I think it's becoming reasonably well cited. So resilience is the idea that you can bounce back. And there's many, many studies. When I was teaching a transport class, we used to talk about how quickly a system would rebound from a shock. So one of the examples we would use would be the London subway, which the underground system had several bombs. 2 bombs actually went off in quick succession. And it took a real hit, but there was a gradual recovery. And that's kind of the model for thinking about transport rebound. You're not going to come back the day after, but you may come back within months or several months. So domestic and short-haul markets, typically being flown by point-to-point carriers, are forecast to recover early. And then progressively later, we will have the wide-body, large capacity aircrafts will come back. But in order to see a rebound in international traffic, like I mentioned, in Newark to Copenhagen, when is that coming back to normal? We have to see a recovery of feeders, people who are going on that route because they're connecting between other points. We will see an above average trend in e-commerce from shipping for pharmaceuticals. And this is driving new opportunities for air cargo because air freighters are needed to provide security, speed, safety, high value, time sensitive materials. Just think of vaccines that need to be kept in special shipping containers. That's requiring some special activities both by the carriers and by the freight consolidators. So I think there's going to be some idea of bounce back, but not immediately. And then there's going to be slow recovery. I think slow recovery, and some of you may not regret this. You say, well, we've changed forever. We're not going to go back to those conference trips. We're going to stick with virtual. But I would imagine that people will want to eat, especially for vacation and family travel, to see relatives, visit grandchildren, etc. The personal travel will bounce back quickly, but lucrative international travel and business trips are going to recover slowly. And maybe in some cases, industries will have discovered ways to substitute those out. And so international travel remains a problem because of travel bans, lack of mobility. If you're thinking about when can I go study abroad again, or when can I travel on a research trip, that remains to be seen. Future options, I think I've indicated fairly clearly that point-to-point networks have more flexibility. The big, large aircraft are problematic, and they can only work if they can be packed to full capacity, and the mood is not there for that right now. We're going to see a much more reliant use on efficient aircraft. And you may have heard a lot in the news about the Boeing 737, and much as that might be lamented, we can certainly see that the 737 is a remarkably efficient aircraft, and especially in its newest configurations. The reason those things sold like hotcakes is that they are just so much more fuel efficient. That means literally, if you take how much fuel it takes to fly a seat a certain number of nautical miles, the Boeing 737 family, and especially the later ones, is knock your socks off better than anything else. And so, and there's comparable Airbus aircraft too, I should say. So they will be coming back as fast as possible on some routes. And amazingly, some of these aircraft can be equipped to fly. There's a kind of a sweet spot around 2,000 nautical miles, as you can think about the US. A little bit longer than that, we might be able to get almost coast to coast. So we're thinking about aircraft that don't normally pop to mind as longer range aircraft, but a well-equipped 737 with extended range can certainly do mid-continent to both coasts very, very easily. And those things are crazy efficient compared to others. And so it's not surprising that we're seeing some rationalization of flights. We see some rationalization of equipment. It's like as if you had an old gas guzzler Chevy and you're going to decide to get a new Prius or Chevy Volt or something that's more fuel efficient. So in addition, we've also had some mergers and acquisitions. This is something we're working on our latest research between what are called full service carriers and low cost carriers. Typically the point-to-point are low cost and the full service are the big gateway aircraft. There's some mergers and acquisitions going on. We're looking, for example, at in Korea, between Korean and Asiana. They're in a merger and acquisition situation, which is kind of contested because it means that one country is agreeing to make one big airline out of two separate airlines. So there's a possibility of a transition from oligopoly to monopoly in some markets, and that bears careful attention when it comes to the public good. So I have a few more slides. Let me just wrap up on a few slides that might kind of summarize some of the messages. So implications of all of this, from the way I look at things, you may agree that not everybody sees the world as a network analyst like I do, but I think certainly we've seen a correction in stage length, more ideal matching of equipment to stage length and emissions, a heightened focus on fuel efficient, clean aircraft. Some of those aircraft that have been sent to park in the desert ain't coming back. They are being taken out of service. And COVID in a sense then purged some of the gas guzzlers. And that's not bad news at all. I also have to say, we have to ask ourselves, are we asking the right questions? So obviously I'm very concerned about networks and their organization and pictures, as Ned Tafe would have been. But we have to ask ourselves, and what is the prognosis for the recovery of demand for air travel? Do we want that to happen? Do we expect that to happen? Do we lament the loss of some of our travel? Should it be possible for me to go to a conference in Korea or Melbourne? I know some of you personally declined or had to cancel invitations for a lot of travel last summer. Was that a bad thing? Would you regret that? Were you happier because you could do Zoom instead? I know that next, I think it's July when I give that plenary talk, I'm not traveling to Frankfurt. I'm going to do it by Zoom. It requires a little juggling with time zones, but it certainly can be done. So there's an organization that I commend to your attention called Airlines for America. It's like an industry group. They do tremendously timely analysis, frequently update. If you want to study airlines, there's a wealth of information, and it's right up to the minute, accurate, far better than an academic can ever do. Those guys have their fingers on the pulse of what's going on. So Airlines for America, this was as of March the 9th, 2021. So just a few days ago. This is their latest prediction for the future. The green line is an optimistic prediction of recovery to the 2019 level. So optimistically, they're thinking 2023 is when we get back to where we were. And pessimistically, 2024 or after. They say the factors that would lead to a more optimistic outcome would be exceptionally effective vaccines. If that happens, that would lead to a sooner recovery. But the openness of the system and that whole idea of the petri dish that I gave you at the beginning is clearly problematic and does not bode well for reintroduction of new waves of disease or new spreads of pandemic. And frankly, regions that were previously doing very well can turn the corner and overnight sort of suddenly become infected and have the virus run like wildfire through their community. I think Papua New Guinea, previously no cases, and then all of a sudden, boom, they were connected and it gets bad. So I have one final slide, and thank you for attention. I think we have one slide to kind of wrap up the gist of what I had to say. So I think if I had to take a take-home message about the pandemic, it certainly had effects far wider and far more significant than just airlines. I have to say that right up front. But airlines took this as an opportunity to rationalize their operations. In some cases, they had to close down completely. As I mentioned, Emirates kind of had to put a complete halt. To get back in the game, they had to really pay careful attention to cleanliness and cabin safety, et cetera. And there is some literature that suggests that airlines are actually now fairly safe, that the internal cleanliness and swabbing of surfaces is so good that your airline carrier is probably not your most, well, it's an opportunity to mingle that's not great, but if you're careful, it may still be safe. They did accept subsidies from governments. That's both in the CARES Act here in the US and the more recent new round of funding. And as we saw in Europe, there's been rounds of funding that was disputed by some carriers like Ryanair, who objected to their competitors getting help. They dropped older and less efficient aircraft. I don't think anybody's going to bemoan that. Some routes are currently not operational. You can go on a service like FlightAware and look, can I fly today between a city pair? And let's say you want to go to Aruba for vacation. Sorry, you're out of luck, because that's not really something. Well, it may be coming back and you may have to go into quarantine, but right now it's something that's being scaled back. I suspect that there will be a return. Airlines will be hungry to get people to fly again. They will offer deals. For a short while, you'll be getting incentives to fly to certain city pairs and packages that are attractive. And then sometime in the future, as Airlines for America suggests, we will have either a pessimistic or optimistic return that will get us more or less back to where we were, and whether airlines return to being able to extract those super profits that they were doing, that remains to be seen. So that kind of wraps up, and I thanks for the opportunity. I want to again give a hat tip to Ned Tafe, who was a real star when it came to digesting geographical data and trying to make patterns and processes come together. So thank you very much. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you, Morton. That was a terrific lecture. My only regret is that you can't hear everyone clapping right now, but next up, we're going to have a Q&A session. So let me put in a word of encouragement to everyone who is listening to the talk, all 32 of you, to take a moment and look at the bottom of your Zoom screen and see where it says Q&A, and open that up, and that will be the space in which you can type questions for Morton. There's already one question that has been asked. It comes from Grant Thrall. I'll read this out loud, Morton, and then you can take it on. Grant asks that you said that a +1 long flight is not more fuel efficient than the same total distance flight when broken into segments. And Grant says, with the large fuel that's consumed with takeoff, how do we solve for the breaking point and its change with respect to the fuel price and consumption? If you could just work that out for us.
Sure. Well, thank you, Grant. Is it okay if I stop sharing my screen? And that
yes, good idea.
So thank you, Grant. A question from a true economic geographer. And this is a kind of a complicated question because, of course, as you mentioned, it does take fuel to take off. It takes fuel to rise to cruising altitude, and then it takes, almost like in cruise control, you go along at a very good fuel consumption rate, and then you have to come down again. There is some non-linearity to this because you load the plane up with fuel, you start burning that fuel off, and as you go further into your flight, you're lightening, the flight is becoming more efficient as it gets longer. So there is a sweet spot. You can solve for the sort of optimal stage length. You can solve for a distance where your aircraft is kind of making that sweet, ideal usage of takeoff fuel, which you're going to have to pay. And the guys who study this literally put in like a 3 or 4 stage model: takeoff, rising to cruise, cruising, coming back to, and there's databases that give you those rates for all kinds of aircraft. And in fact, that's one of the things we used in our paper. I would have to say that you may think of this in almost another feedback way that might not be immediately evident. The airline manufacturers, the mainframe manufacturers, they're super clever too. And they realize that geography and spacing of your cities is, you need an aircraft that will fly 2,000 nautical miles or 3,000 nautical miles. Let's make you an aircraft that's perfect for that range. So the Boeing 737 MAX, in some ways, is a aircraft mainframe respondent building a frame that is very suitable to that range, as opposed to, say, an Embraer or a 767 or an aircraft that would be ill-suited. But yeah, that's a great question, that there is a trade-off, and a great deal of simulation work goes into designing that ideal mix. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, let's pop some questions into the Q&A. And Morton, while we're waiting for them to do so, I have one from myself. Coming back to your aside concerning the question of whether we really want the global airline industry to return to where it was before, we're all aware of the global climate challenge. And many people have suggested that we're not really paying the true cost of all the fuel that we're burning. So let me throw out a what-if scenario for you. Many climate activists, myself included, imagine that what we really need to do is put in place a serious Pigovian tax on carbon so that the cost of airline fuel goes up fairly significantly. So how would that change the geography of the airline industry? What would be the likely effects of a significant increase of the cost of airline fuel?
Well, great question, and it's a sort of a timely observation that certainly, well, fuel prices definitely drive what airlines do. It's a huge share of their cost, apart from labor and sort of financing their debt. Fuel, I think, is a very big fraction of their cost. If you then decide to if you tax the airline, you have to find a way to tax their variable operations. So you tax the fuel. Airlines are not stupid. They're going to try to avoid that. So one thing that may happen is that different places that don't bring that, unless this is across the board, there's going to be loopholes and gaps. And European countries do try to provide more of a tax on uses of carbon that airlines are sensitive to. But there was quite a debate around whether US and Europe would do this reciprocally, or would they do it one-sidedly, or would it, in fact, this gets into the weeds a little bit, but they're called so-called open skies agreements between countries that allow people to fly in and out of their country kind of without harm. If I start taxing you upon landing, is that in contravention? So this gets way beyond my pay scale. People got really, really concerned about this. How we looked at it was, if there was let's say a fixed charge for you taking off in addition to your takeoff charge of the aircraft itself, you would factor that in then to the cost of running that particular flight. And provided there was a sturdy demand for that flight, you'd probably pay that tax. I think kind of corollary question to yours is much more significant. Should we concern ourselves with the 100 tons of fuel that we put in that aircraft? That's just one flight from Frankfurt to Los Angeles. That was mind-boggling. I mean, I looked at the cockpit video of the aircraft, and there's a display that shows the weight of the fuel upon takeoff. And at the end of the flight, that's all being squirted into the atmosphere. And it's just mind-boggling. I can't tell you how anguished I am about that.
Very good. Thanks for that. Following up on that, I have a question from Alvaro and another one from Harvey. And then I see that there's some popping over in the chat as well. So Alvaro says, thanks for a great talk, Morton. Assuming that airlines have fuel price levels changing, I'm not sure if that says changing or changing in their future projections. What are those? Do airlines project a future with increasing, decreasing, or steady fuel prices? Okay, so it must mean changing. Yeah, where are fuel prices going, and what does this mean for the future of the industry?
Okay, great question, Al. So again, extremely complicated topic that could take almost a whole lecture. But airlines, I think I might have repeated myself, they're not stupid. They do what's called hedging. So you're in the business of flying aircraft, which take a lot of fuel. You can enter a contract to get future delivery of fuel at a fixed price. If you play your cards right, next year comes and you have fuel cheaper than the going rate, you made money. On the other hand, if there's a collapse and you just paid too much for that fuel next year, you're out of the money. So right now, during the pandemic, airlines are not burning fuel. There's plenty of fuel. There's been a collapse. So some of those contracts are in a sense upside down. They paid too much for fuel they didn't use. But I think airlines are very attuned to contracting and hedging, trying to lay off some of the risk of their exposure to very high fuel costs down the road. And again, hat tip to Ryanair, their hedging operation is second to none. And their annual reports of airlines will list their hedging positions, and you can read them to find out, did they do well on their hedging? Ideally, they kind of break even, it doesn't cost them. If they do super well, they're hedging and benefiting. So there's a whole other detour we can go into, but generally speaking, airlines are trying to protect themselves against uncertainty in fuel costs.
Great, and then we have a follow-up question from Harvey Miller, who says, thanks for the nice talk, by the way. Morton, what do you think about the role of high-speed rail? High-speed rail is generally viewed as a green alternative for short to medium routes, with air more competitive for the longer routes. High-speed rail is also touted as a feeder to hubs. What do you think?
I think that Europe provides some great examples. I mentioned Lufthansa before. I believe that you can take, you're all used to buying an airline ticket and you get kind of a flight number like A32, and you're going to go on flight A32. In some cases in Europe, the first leg of your flight is a train to Frankfurt, and then the second leg of your flight is the flight. So when well integrated, I think a well choreographed rail network can provide a seamless connection to a decently operating airline system. I regret that we're not really there yet in the US. I mean, there is no way that we could get a train connector that's going to be reliable, at least in mid-continent. I believe Newark, New Jersey, does offer an Amtrak connection. And so you can go Amtrak to Newark as if you're taking a flight. But yeah, Harv, I wish we had, China's made great strides in this, having, long range and efficient high-speed train that has provided, a get ahead move for them in terms of connectivity. In some ways, their airlines may be a little behind ours in that they're, when I described one hub and multi-hub and stuff, that was indicating that we have a mature and rationalized, organized network. Somebody figured this stuff out and they wanted to go this way or that way. We don't have a hodgepodge mixture. In some ways, less evolved airline networks are more of a hodgepodge. They're not yet, it's as if the mixture had not yet congealed into several major hubs. So in some ways, the train system between urban areas in China provides a terrific alternative. And if it's very high speed, you can do that 400-mile route super quick and don't get in a plane. Don't burn that 100 tons of fuel.
Very good. Brian Mark says, thanks for your fascinating insights, and asks, what is happening to private jet air travel?
I don't know a whole lot about that other than, Columbus here, we're lucky we have NetJets here in town. So NetJets is a company you may not know much about, but it's a very successful provider of timeshares on corporate jets. Beautifully run operation, highly sophisticated logistics, sensitive to weather, to having nice, clean equipment where people need it. I don't really follow this closely, but my sense from reading the New York Times is that may have gone up during the pandemic, that people have been willing to plop down a couple extra $1,000s to fly safely or to charter or to commission private jets or timeshare jets. I could look into this, Brian, but I think my gut feeling is that the COVID has not harmed that sector, which was already doing very well. Let me just give you one quick vignette. So Jackson Hole, Wyoming, not an easy place to get to by commercial aircraft. If you're a wealthy guy who wants to go skiing, you get the NetJets little subscription, and that's one way to get there. That's a whole different pay scale from what I'm familiar with, but I believe that sector is doing quite well. Did you have something else, Brian, in mind apart from that kind of sector?
Brian, if you want, you can pop your follow-up question into the chat if you'd like to. In the meantime, I'll read Stephen's question. Stephen points out that President Biden has made infrastructure investment a priority and asks, how does the US airport infrastructure compare with other countries in the world? Should this really be a target for infrastructure investment in the US? Or should we follow Harvey's preference and put the money into bike paths or high-speed rail?
Yeah, great question. Speaking personally, my druthers would be that we would balance the ticket and we would spread some of that investment into other infrastructure. Even urban transit is another area that is in need. Just to comment briefly on American airport infrastructure. I know a little bit about this because I can participate in a kind of a monthly telecon with people who do operations research for airports. And so we have a very nice airport system. The big problem is we have a capacity constraint system. And one of the problems is that congestion and capacity constraints at our major carriers, at our major airports, and what are called metroplex. When you think of Columbus, we have one big airport, that's fine. But the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area has 4 airports. And so you almost need to have a choreography of landing, departure. If you look at a map of that departure system, it's a hugely complex organization. So I think investment in soft techniques for extracting more capacity from the current system, so-called next gen techniques. And this is something mundane, like allowing aircraft to follow along behind each other a bit closer than now. If you can pack them in more closely and allow them to land in a more regularized, smooth way, you can get more bang for the buck. That would be building more airports and would get more efficiency from the current system. There are, some fine minds are engaged in trying to think of that and try to eke out some extra efficiency in that kind of range. And as Harvey popped up a comment there that, certainly we are in different modes here. We have buses, trains, ferries, bikes, taxis, Uber. That's kind of one scale within metro areas. When we're talking inter-urban transportation, let's say you need to go to St. Louis tomorrow, or to Minneapolis, St. Paul, or Miami heading to South America, we really are talking about airline travel. And at the moment, there's no rail substitute. Car travel is not an option. At the very most, you're going to drive to Dayton, perhaps. But at the moment, we are pretty much hamstrung by air connectivity and accessibility. So thanks for the attention, because almost every question, I don't care to brag, but if you take a look at my Vita, we've been looking at everything to do with this, ground transport to airports, competition between airports when there's more than one. I personally have not worked on high-speed rail, but students who worked at Cura with Harvey and others have studied high-speed rail as an alternative. So hate to say this, the sky's the limit. We've got lots of different angles that we could look into here.
Excellent. Well, that might be the perfect stopping point. Good argument for taking transportation geography seriously and into the future as a tool for solving puzzles related to the global climate emergency. So Morton, thanks again for a great talk. And this brings to an end the 2020 to 21 speaker series, A World on Edge. Thanks everyone for tuning in for these great talks, and I look forward to having you join us again next year. Becky Mansfield is taking up the mantle, and she will be putting together a great slate of speakers with the details to be advertised later this year. So keep your eyes open for the announcement about the 21 to 22 speaker series, probably to be announced around the time of the start of next school year. Morton, did you just raised your hand? Do you want to have a final word?
I just want to say thank you very much for the invitation. And again, hats off. Miss you all guys in the department, and hope to see you soon in better circumstances. And again, we should give a hat tip to Ned Tafe, who was a strong and important figure in our discipline, and whose influence went far beyond geography and the social sciences. And I think he helped us to carve out a pitch for our work. So thank you for that, and thank you for the invitation, and Darla and Suzanne and Kim for setting this up.
Wonderful.
Cheers.
Wonderful. Thank you, Morton. All right, everyone. TGIF, it's minutes to 5. Enjoy the fine weather this weekend, and look forward to seeing you at the next geography event in the fall. Thanks all.